The people who call you a nobody are often the same people who never bothered to learn your story. That sentence kept repeating in my mind as I parked my aging silver sedan outside the Carter family estate on a warm Saturday afternoon. The driveway was already packed with luxury vehicles lined up like a showroom display, each one seeming to remind me that I did not belong there. It had been 8 months since my husband, Michael Carter, passed away, and in those 8 months I had learned something painful. Grief does not always bring families together. Sometimes it reveals who they truly are. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the large white house where Michael had grown up. For more than 20 years, I had attended birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and summer cookouts there. Yet somehow, after Michael was gone, I felt like a stranger walking toward a place that had never really accepted me. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and smoothed the sleeves of my navy blue dress. It was simple, modest, and appropriate for a family gathering. Still, I could already imagine the looks I would receive. As soon as I entered the backyard, conversation softened. Not stopped completely. Just softened enough for me to notice. Patricia Carter, my mother-in-law, stood near the patio table surrounded by relatives. Her smile faded the second she saw me. "Emily," she said flatly. "You made it." Not welcome. Not good to see you. Just those 2 words. Around her, several relatives exchanged glances before returning to their drinks. I forced a polite smile. "Thank you for inviting me." Patricia nodded without enthusiasm and turned back to her conversation before I could say anything else. I found an empty chair near the edge of the gathering and sat quietly. Laughter filled the yard. Children ran across the grass. Plates clinked. Music played softly from outdoor speakers. Everyone seemed connected to everyone except me. A few minutes later, Michael's younger brother Ryan approached with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Still driving that old thing?" he asked, nodding toward my car. "I figured Michael would have left you something better." Several people nearby chuckled. I smiled politely and looked down at my glass of iced tea. Ryan continued. "Then again, maybe he knew what he was doing." More laughter followed. My cheeks grew warm, but I refused to react. Over the years, I had learned that some people enjoyed watching others lose their composure. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. The afternoon dragged on, and the comments kept coming. Small remarks, little jokes, subtle insults disguised as harmless conversation. By sunset, one thing had become painfully clear. To the Carter family, I was not Michael's widow. I was not family. I was simply the woman they believed had nothing left. And none of them had the slightest idea that before the night was over, something hidden for years was about to change everything they thought they knew about me, about Michael, and about their own family. As the evening settled over the Carter estate, the atmosphere became even more uncomfortable. Strings of warm lights illuminated the backyard, and guests gathered around long tables covered with expensive food and decorations, but no amount of elegance could hide the tension I felt sitting there alone. Every conversation seemed to circle around money, success, and status. Eventually, Ryan stood near the center of the patio holding a drink while several relatives listened. He was clearly enjoying the attention. "Michael always carried more weight than anyone realized," he said. "Running the company, handling family obligations, solving everyone's problems. That kind of pressure changes a man." Several people nodded. Then his eyes drifted toward me. "Some people benefited from all that hard work more than others." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. The meaning was obvious. Patricia took a sip of wine and added, "Michael had a generous heart. Sometimes too generous." More laughter followed. I focused on my plate and said nothing. Years ago, comments like those would have ruined my evening. Now they simply reminded me how little these people truly knew. Across the table sat Michael's cousin Jennifer. She leaned forward and asked loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Emily, have you thought about what comes next for you?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said, pretending to sound concerned, "Michael handled everything. It must be difficult starting over. Before I could answer, Ryan laughed. I am sure she will figure something out. Several people joined him. Even those who remained silent avoided meeting my eyes. The conversation moved on, but the damage had already been done. They had made their assumptions long ago. In their minds, I was a woman whose best years were behind her. A widow living off memories. Someone with no influence and no future. What hurt most was not the insults. It was realizing how completely they had erased my role in Michael's life. None of them spoke about the years we spent building our life together. None of them mentioned the sacrifices, the setbacks, the long nights, or the challenges we faced side by side. To them, Michael had accomplished everything alone. As darkness settled completely, Patricia stood and tapped a glass for attention. Conversation stopped. "Thank you all for coming," she announced. "Family means everything, especially after a loss." The irony nearly made me smile. She continued speaking about tradition, legacy, and honoring Michael's memory. Then she invited everyone inside for dessert and coffee. Guests slowly rose from their seats. I considered leaving. There seemed little reason to stay any longer. That was when a black sedan rolled into the driveway. At first, nobody paid attention. But moments later, the front door opened and an older man in a dark suit stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately. It was Daniel Whitmore, the attorney who had worked with Michael for years. A strange silence spread through the room as Daniel looked around and asked a simple question. "Is the entire Carter family present?" Suddenly, every conversation stopped. Ryan frowned. Patricia looked confused. And for the first time all evening, I saw uncertainty appear on faces that had seemed so confident only moments before. Daniel Whitmore placed his leather briefcase on the dining room table while more than 24 members of the Carter family gathered around him. Nobody seemed to understand why he had arrived, but everyone immediately sensed that this was not a social visit. The confident smiles that had filled the room only minutes earlier began to disappear. Patricia stepped forward first. "Daniel, what is this about?" she asked. The attorney looked around carefully before answering. "Several years ago, Michael gave me specific instructions. He told me that if a certain condition was met, I was to deliver a sealed envelope during a family gathering attended by all immediate family members." A wave of whispers spread across the room. Ryan folded his arms. "What condition?" Daniel opened his briefcase and removed a thick cream-colored envelope. The room became completely silent. "The condition was simple," he said. "The envelope could only be delivered after Michael's passing and only when every person named in this document was present." My heart began to beat faster. I recognized Michael's handwriting immediately. Even from across the room, I could see his familiar signature on the front. For a moment it felt as though time had stopped. 8 months had passed since I had heard his voice, yet suddenly he felt closer than he had in months. Patricia stared at the envelope. "What exactly is in it?" Daniel shook his head. "I have never opened it. Michael instructed me to deliver it untouched." Ryan laughed nervously. "This is probably some sentimental letter." A few relatives nodded in agreement, but their expressions suggested otherwise. Curiosity had already taken hold of the room. Daniel checked a document inside his briefcase. "There is one more instruction." The whispers immediately stopped. Michael specifically requested that Emily Carter be the person to open the envelope. Every eye in the room turned toward me. For the first time that evening, nobody was laughing. Nobody was making jokes. Nobody was pretending I was invisible. Patricia's face tightened. "Why Emily?" she asked. Daniel simply replied, "Those were Michael's instructions." An uncomfortable silence followed. I could feel dozens of eyes watching me as Daniel walked toward me carrying the envelope. My hands trembled slightly when he placed it in front of me. The paper looked old, as though it had been waiting years for this exact moment. I ran my fingers across Michael's handwriting. The room remained silent. Even the children had stopped talking. Ryan shifted impatiently. "Well, go ahead," he said. "Open it." I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to leave. Part of me was afraid of what Michael might have written. But a larger part of me needed to know. Slowly, I broke the seal. Several sheets of paper rested inside along with another smaller envelope that had a single sentence written across the front. The moment I read those words, my breath caught in my throat. Michael had written, "If they are finally hearing this, then the truth can no longer be hidden." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the dining room felt almost unreal. I stared at the words Michael had written on the smaller envelope, while everyone around me waited. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first page of the letter. The moment I saw his handwriting, a wave of emotion hit me. It felt as though Michael was standing beside me again. I took a slow breath and began reading aloud. "If you are hearing this, then I am no longer there to tell this story myself. That means it is finally time for certain truths to come into the light." The room remained completely still. Even Ryan, who always seemed to have something sarcastic to say, stayed quiet. I continued. "First, I want everyone in this room to understand something. Throughout my life, many people praised my success. They praised the company I built, the investments I made, and the life I created. They called me determined. They called me talented. Some even called me brilliant. But there is one thing very few people ever understood. None of those achievements would have been possible without Emily." Several heads turned toward me. I could see confusion spreading across their faces. Patricia frowned immediately. I kept reading. "Many of you believe Emily entered my life after I became successful. That is not true. When Emily met me, I had nothing but debt, uncertainty, and dreams that were far bigger than my bank account." The room was silent except for my voice. The first apartment we lived in was less than 700 square feet. We shared one old car. There were months when we worried about paying bills. During those years, Emily worked longer hours than anyone knew. She carried burdens she never complained about. She sacrificed opportunities that would have advanced her own career because she believed in mine. I paused for a moment. My eyes filled with tears. Those memories came rushing back. The tiny apartment. The unpaid invoices. The endless stress. Michael continued through the letter. There were nights when I was ready to quit. Emily never let me. There were deals that failed. She stood beside me. There were moments when I doubted myself completely. She believed enough for both of us. Jennifer slowly lowered her eyes. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The version of history they had repeated for years was beginning to crack. Then I reached the next paragraph. "If anyone in this room believes Emily depended on me, they have misunderstood our entire marriage. The truth is much closer to the opposite. There were times when I depended on her far more than she ever depended on me." Ryan's expression hardened. Patricia crossed her arms. Neither seemed pleased by what they were hearing. But Michael was not finished. In fact, it felt as though he was only beginning. As I turned the page, I noticed Daniel Whitmore watching me carefully. He knew something. I could see it in his face. And when I looked down at the next section of the letter, I immediately understood why. The words written there revealed that Michael had been hiding a secret from his entire family for more than 15 years. My eyes moved slowly across the next page while the entire room waited. The first sentence alone changed the atmosphere completely. "For more than 15 years, I have allowed people to believe a version of my success that was incomplete." I swallowed hard and continued reading. I did not hide the truth because I was ashamed. I hid it because Emily never wanted recognition. She always believed that what we built belonged to us, not to her alone. But after watching how certain people treated her, I decided that one day the full story would have to be told. The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. 15 years ago, the company nearly collapsed. We were less than 30 days away from shutting down operations. Payroll was due. Investors were leaving. Several contracts had fallen apart. I had exhausted every option available to me. I paused briefly before reading the next lines. What nobody knew was that Emily received an opportunity during that same period. A major consulting firm offered her a position that would have doubled our household income and provided long-term financial security. Accepting that offer would have been the logical decision. Most people would have taken it without hesitation. I could feel tears building in my eyes because I remembered that moment perfectly. The offer had been real. The salary had seemed life-changing at the time. Michael continued through the letter. Instead of accepting the position, Emily made a different choice. She turned it down and used her savings to keep our business alive. She reviewed contracts, reorganized operations, negotiated with vendors, and spent countless evenings solving problems that I could not solve myself. During the most difficult period of my professional life, Emily became the reason the company survived. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. Patricia's expression slowly shifted from skepticism to disbelief. Ryan stared at the floor. Many people believe I built Carter Holdings through determination and intelligence. Those qualities helped, but they were not enough. The truth is simple. Without Emily, Carter Holdings would not exist today. The words seemed to hang in the air long after I read them. Michael's handwriting filled every page with details that only he and I had ever discussed. He described late nights at our kitchen table. He described unpaid bills stacked beside business plans. He described my efforts to support him when everything seemed impossible. Then came another sentence that seemed to strike the room like lightning. Several members of my family spent years congratulating me for achievements that should have belonged equally to Emily. She never corrected them. She never demanded credit. She never complained. Her silence was not weakness. It was generosity. Nobody knew where to look. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had vanished completely. Yet as I turned another page, I realized this was still not the secret Daniel Whitmore had expected. This was only the foundation. Michael had spent several pages restoring the truth about my role in our lives, but the next section carried a different tone entirely. The handwriting looked firmer, more deliberate, almost as if he had prepared himself for something difficult. And when I read the first line of the next paragraph, I immediately understood why. What I have shared so far explains how our company survived. What comes next explains who nearly destroyed it. The moment I read that sentence, the room seemed to shrink around me. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the pages in my hands. I took a slow breath and continued. The greatest threat to our company did not come from competitors. It did not come from the economy. It did not come from investors. It came from someone I trusted. A ripple of tension spread across the room. Ryan shifted uneasily in his chair. Patricia's expression tightened. Michael's words continued. For years, I protected this secret because exposing it would have damaged relationships that I hoped could be repaired. I believed time would change people. Unfortunately, I was wrong. My heart pounded as I turned the page. 15 years ago, during the most difficult period in our company's history, confidential financial information was repeatedly leaked outside the business. Contracts disappeared. Negotiations failed unexpectedly. Competitors gained access to information they should never have possessed. Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. Daniel Whitmore remained completely still. It was obvious that he already knew everything written in the letter. At first, I believed these events were coincidences. Then evidence began to appear. Over several months, I quietly documented what was happening. The results were devastating. The room had become so silent that I could hear the ticking of the antique clock mounted on the far wall. The person responsible was not an employee. The person responsible was not a business rival. The person responsible was a member of my own family. Ryan immediately sat upright. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Nobody responded. I continued reading. I am aware that some people hearing this letter may become uncomfortable. That discomfort is deserved. Truth often arrives late, but it arrives nonetheless. Patricia's face had grown pale. Jennifer stared at the table. The individual involved repeatedly shared sensitive information with outsiders in exchange for personal opportunities and advantages. Those actions nearly cost dozens of employees their jobs and nearly destroyed everything Emily and I had worked to build. My hands trembled slightly. The letter felt heavier with every page. Then I reached the next paragraph. What hurt me most was not the financial damage. It was the betrayal. I spent years helping this person. I defended them when others criticized them. I trusted them completely. Ryan suddenly stood. Who exactly are we talking about? He demanded. Daniel calmly replied. Sit down and let the letter continue. Ryan hesitated before slowly lowering himself back into his chair. I looked down at the next page. Michael's handwriting appeared darker, as if he had pressed harder against the paper while writing. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, emails, meeting logs, and witness statements all pointed to the same conclusion. There was never any doubt about what happened. A chill moved through the room. Nobody wanted to hear the next sentence, yet everyone needed to. I swallowed hard and continued reading. The family member responsible for those actions was Ryan Carter. The sound of someone dropping a glass echoed through the room as every head turned toward him at once. The room erupted into shocked whispers the moment Ryan's name was spoken. He immediately jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. That is a lie, he said. Michael would never write something like that. Nobody responded. For the first time in years, Ryan no longer controlled the conversation. The attention he had always enjoyed now felt very different. It was not admiration. It was suspicion. I looked down at the letter and continued reading. I know Ryan will deny these accusations if this letter is ever read publicly. That is why I spent years collecting documentation. Copies of every record referenced in this letter are currently stored with Daniel Whitmore. Every head turned toward Daniel. The attorney nodded once. The gesture was small, but it carried enormous weight. Ryan stared at him. You knew about this? Daniel answered calmly. I followed my client's instructions. The room grew even quieter. Michael's words continued. I never pursued legal action because I wanted to believe people could change. More importantly, I did not want my mother to suffer through a public family scandal. Looking back, that decision may have been a mistake. Patricia lowered her eyes. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to speak. There is another truth that must be addressed. I read. Ryan was not the only person aware of what happened. A wave of tension swept across the room. Several relatives looked toward Patricia immediately. My hands tightened around the pages. I already knew where this was heading. Years after discovering the leaks, I privately shared the evidence with my mother. I believed she would encourage accountability and help repair the damage. Instead, she asked me to remain silent for the sake of family harmony. Patricia's face turned pale. No, she whispered. Michael misunderstood. But her voice lacked conviction. Michael's letter continued. My mother loved her family, and I understand why she made that choice. However, protecting the truth came at a cost. The person most harmed by that decision was Emily. My throat tightened. While others were allowed to preserve their reputations, Emily endured years of judgment. She was blamed for decisions she never made. She was excluded from conversations she should have been part of. She was treated as though she contributed nothing when she had contributed more than anyone realized. Nobody could meet my eyes anymore. Jennifer stared at the floor. Several relatives looked visibly ashamed. The same people who had laughed at dinner now sat in complete silence. If you are hearing this letter, Michael wrote, then I ask every person in this room to remember something important. Character is revealed not when life is easy, but when truth becomes inconvenient. I paused. The weight of those words settled heavily over everyone present. Ryan slowly sank back into his chair. Patricia looked as though she had aged years in a matter of minutes. Yet as devastating as these revelations were, I could tell the letter was still building towards something even larger. Near the bottom of the page, Michael had underlined an entire sentence. As I read it silently, my heart nearly stopped. The final secret he had protected for more than a decade was about to be revealed, and it would change far more than the Carter family's reputation. My eyes remained fixed on the underlined sentence for several seconds before I finally found the strength to continue. Every person in the room seemed frozen in place. The final decision I made concerning my estate was not based on money, Michael wrote. It was based on gratitude. The room was silent. Many people will assume that this letter exists to expose mistakes and settle old scores. That is not why I wrote it. I wrote it because there is one person who spent decades putting everyone else before herself, and I refused to leave this world without making certain she was finally seen. My vision blurred slightly as I continued. During the last 12 years of my life, Emily quietly led several initiatives that helped expand our business, strengthen our community partnerships, and support families facing hardship. Most people never knew because she never sought recognition. In many cases, she intentionally removed her own name from projects and allowed others to receive the credit. Several relatives looked genuinely shocked. They had spent years assuming I contributed very little to the success surrounding them. Michael continued. The charitable foundation that our family frequently celebrates did not begin with my idea. It began with Emily's. The scholarship programs, the community grants, and the support services that helped. Hundreds of families all originated from conversations she started years ago. Jennifer covered her mouth with her hand. Patricia slowly lowered her head. There is another reason I am sharing this now, the letter said. Several years ago, I made a legal decision that only Daniel Whitmore and Emily are aware of. Every person in the room immediately looked toward Daniel. Even I felt my heart begin racing. I knew some of what Michael had arranged, but I had never seen this portion of the letter. After witnessing Emily repeatedly sacrifice her own recognition, I decided to ensure that the future of our charitable work would remain in the hands of the person who truly understood its purpose. A heavy silence filled the room. For that reason, ownership and leadership authority over the Carter Family Foundation were transferred years ago into Emily's control through a protected legal structure. The transition was completed before my passing. Several people gasped. Ryan looked stunned. Patricia's eyes widened. The foundation had become one of the most respected parts of the family's public reputation. For years, everyone assumed it would remain under family control through traditional channels. Michael's next words removed all doubt. Effective immediately upon the reading of this letter, Emily possesses full authority regarding the foundation's direction, governance, funding priorities, and future leadership. That decision is final. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed capable of speaking. Michael continued one last time. If anyone feels surprised, they should ask themselves why they never noticed the person standing quietly beside them all these years. The answer has nothing to do with Emily. It has everything to do with what they chose not to see. As I reached the end of the page, I realized the room had completely transformed. The people who had dismissed me only hours earlier were no longer looking at me with pity or contempt. They were looking at me with something entirely different. And for the first time that evening, they were beginning to understand exactly who Michael had believed I was all along. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. I lowered the final page slightly and looked around the room. The same people who had avoided me earlier now seemed unable to look away. The difference was not the legal authority Michael had given me. It was the truth they had finally been forced to face. Michael had spent years seeing value in me that others refused to recognize. Now his voice had made that impossible to ignore. Patricia was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet and unsteady. "Emily," she said, "I did not know." I looked at her for several seconds. There had been a time when hearing those words would have felt like victory. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness. "You could have known," I replied gently. "You just never asked?" The room fell silent again. Patricia lowered her eyes. There was no anger left in her expression. Only regret. Ryan remained seated at the far end of the table. The confidence that had defined him earlier had disappeared completely. He stared at the floor without saying a word. Nobody defended him. Nobody challenged the letter. The truth had spoken for itself. Jennifer finally broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I think all of us do." Several relatives nodded. Others quietly agreed. One after another, people began acknowledging things they had ignored for years. Some apologized for assumptions. Others admitted they had followed the opinions of stronger personalities instead of forming their own judgments. None of it erased the past, but it felt honest. And honesty was something this family had been missing for a very long time. Daniel Whitmore closed his briefcase and stood quietly near the doorway. His work was finished. Michael's final wishes had been delivered exactly as intended. I looked down at the smaller envelope that had remained unopened throughout the evening. My name appeared across the front in Michael's handwriting. Daniel smiled softly. "That one was meant only for you," he said. I carefully opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page. The room remained silent as I read it to myself. Michael's final message was simple. He wrote that success had never been the thing he valued most. Not the company. Not the foundation. Not the recognition. He wrote that the greatest blessing of his life had been sharing it with someone who never stopped believing in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence. "If they finally see you now, that is good. But never forget that your worth was never dependent on their ability to recognize it." Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the foundation. Not because of the revelations. But because after all these months, I could hear Michael's heart in those words. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I stood, thanked everyone for listening, and walked toward the door. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody needed to. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt lighter than I had in years. The family gathering had begun with people calling me a nobody. It ended with something far more important than revenge. It ended with the truth. And sometimes the truth is the most powerful legacy a person can leave behind.